When I suddenly see myself in the depths of the mirror, I take fright. I can scarcely believe that I have limits, that I am outlined and defined. I feel myself to be dispersed in the atmosphere, thinking inside other creatures, living inside things beyond myself. When I suddenly see myself in the mirror, I am not startled because I find myself ugly or beautiful. I discover, in fact, that I possess another quality. When I haven't looked at myself for some time, I almost forget that I am human. I tend to forget my past, and I find myself with the same deliverance from purpose and conscience as something that is barely alive. I'm also surprised to find, as I gaze into the pale mirror with open eyes, that there is so much in me beyond what is known, so much that remains ever silent. What happens when you come into contact with the absurd? What do you do now that you know you have no limits? That all you know to be logical, safe, and determined now coalesces with the horror of its lack of validity? What do you do when all systems and method of distillation are no longer viable? What do you do when one day you are living your life and a massive hole emerges, grows, and burns through all your predispositions about life, about existence? How can one live without an axis? Is this the human body? A proxy? Can I survive like this? Can I survive like this? For those of you who want to cosplay dark femininity, at times I envy you. I'm happy that for you, dark femininity is simply being mysterious, wearing smoky, cat-like eyeliner, not texting him back, taking control, or being feisty or fiery or whatever. I envy you that you're able to use it like a costume you're trying on. Something to make you feel sexy, to embrace something so unlike yourself to get what you want. I'm happy that dark femininity is that for you. Because for anyone who has read Clarice Lispector, who can read her like a transcription of the ineffable, dark femininity for us feels like holding a lid over an atomic explosion. And we are growing weary. Because dark femininity is not a costume. It's terror. It's pure terror. I've been meaning to talk about dark femininity probably for a few years now, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to talk about it until I read Clarice Lispector. I found a woman that was so intimately familiar with what I categorize as the dark feminine. The dark feminine, for me, hails from the fear of the unknown. From the unknown that is latent in Mother Nature and from which perennial representations of the feminine have manifested for centuries. The dark feminine is a weighted balance, it's an extreme, and reading Clarice Lispector is like uncovering something forbidden. Though I think when I first started reading her, it was extremely comfortable, of course, to have thoughts and these feelings that were indescribable, and terror, just pure terror. Having them written down and described was comforting. To be aware of the depth from which we came, to be conscious of the beginning and the end. This de profundis that no matter how science has adjusted itself, questions become only more numerous in the face of it. Clarice Lispector was a profound writer. Though having been relatively successful throughout her life, only just penetrated the literary world in non-Latin countries through the New Directions publications dedication to a large translation of her work into English. She was a Ukrainian-born but Brazilian author. And from the introductions that I have read, they even say no matter how we are to translate her thoughts into English, all of it still sounds insane in her native language. It sounds just as insane as it does in Portuguese. as it does in English. Clarice's writing is metaphysical to the extreme. And her often female, which appropriately female protagonists, continuously have the same battle to decipher their existence, to codify the chaos that becomes very immediately apparent just from something very innocuous. It's to contain this boundless truth that is revealed to you all of a sudden. Much of her writing is intense inner monologues, so much so that the plot is never really a plot. It's a vague touch of reality and a launching off point for this insanely heavy introspection. And even more so, and this is something that I really love about Clarice's work, it seems like her characters never asked to be human in the first place. Her subjects feel alien, not human at all. And like they're kind of foreign entities dropped into our heavily structured, austere world and trying to make sense of it, trying to practice being human almost. In her book, Near to the Wild Heart, she says, "I see myself abandoned, solitary, thrown into a cell without dimensions, where light and shadows are silent phantoms. Within my inner self, I find the silence I am seeking, but it leaves me so bereft of any memory of any human being and of me myself that I transform this impression into the certainty of solitude. Were I to cry out, I can no longer see things clearly. My voice would receive the same indifferent echo from the walls of the earth." Near to the Wild Heart is a simple book in terms of plot. Joanna, the main protagonist, is orphaned at a young age, gets married, has an affair, and leaves her husband. The rest is thought and introspection. Joanna has a particularly difficult time understanding the structures we put in place here in society, on Earth, whatever. Her actions, her worries, her preoccupations seem to transcend what we know to be good and evil. And it just seems like she has far more troubling things to worry about. There is a brief but vital moment in the book where Joanna, as a young girl, steals something. And when she's caught, she's entirely shameless, but more so not even affected or cognizant that it was wrong. And she stole something because she simply wanted to. It is as if Joanna's desires transcend our ethics and that her actions alone have their own sovereignty. She simply is, so she does. And toward the end of the book, this theme of her almost being not human. It's throughout the book, but these two particular instances were quite strange to me. Toward the end of the book, she is having a final conversation which will end the marriage between her and her husband, Octavio. And he is very angry. He's yelling at her, which normally this will erupt into an emotional response for anybody. Nobody likes to be yelled at. This will probably make your adrenaline rise. But for Joanna, it doesn't do that at all. She's entirely indifferent to his anger in this one moment, and it's in a way I've never heard described before. Octavio's yelling aren't arrows, but merged with everything else. His bellows were not isolated arrows, but merged with what existed. It seems like here that Joanna has, for a moment, achieved total equalization. All emotion vibrates on the same wavelength in confluence with all other things that exist. She's totally impervious, indifferent, and neutral because she is omnipotent, which is what I'm trying to say. She feels she's alien. She doesn't feel human at all. She's kind of one with all things. And there are moments where she breaks through and she does react like a normal person does, but it's only because she reacts that way because she feels she needs to respond in a certain way. All of the book, like most of Clarice's books, they defend the character, always. They support that the protagonist is somehow untainted by their transgressions or their lack of empathy because they are learning. And Clarice herself has said that she wants to write like somebody learning. The extensive inner monologues always prove this, because the protagonists are always analyzing, questioning, and suffering due to this hypercognition. Their suffering is never on account of others, though. It is suffering that is experienced wholly alone. This is where this terror comes from, this dread. It's coming in communion with the unknown, and you have to do it alone. Impossible to explain. She was slowly straying from the zone where things have a set shape and edges, where everything has a solid, immutable name. She was sinking deeper into the liquid, quite unfathomable regions where mists hung as vague and cool as those of the dawn. Now, it's not only the disturbed nature of Clarice's subject matter that I feel anoints her for me as this high priestess of dark femininity, but it's the way Clarice writes, too. It's evidence all on its own. Her prose itself feels distinctly feminine. And not too long ago, I was reading a paper about Anais Nin, not so coincidentally about Anais, another woman I deeply admire. It was called The Multimedia of Our Unconscious Life, Anais Nin in the Synthesis of the Arts by Sandra Ream. And Anais Nin's prose was included in the genre of what was coined in the 70s as feminine writing. Writing which is characterized as fluid, music-like, poetic, and avant-garde. Some people have described it as writing from the womb. It's a way of writing which feels like a stream of consciousness, this fluidity. And this consciousness, this interpretation of life, seems to have been informed by centuries of experience. There is an effortlessness, a knowing about it, an all-knowing. Its existence devoid of reason, and it's purely empirical. Agua Viva, one of Clarice's last works, is controversially just that. It's a stream of consciousness, and she literally wrote it that way. Any thought she had, no matter if it was philosophical or mundane or simply an observation, she included it. In the introduction, they quote her talking about her writing, saying, "Could it be that what I am writing you is beyond thought? Because reason is what it isn't. Whoever can stop reasoning, let them come along with me." And this is what I want to crescendo into the most intimately tangled misconception about feminine chaos, and that is mental illness. While Clarice Lispector wrote novels, she was also arguably more gifted in writing short stories. And one of my favorites was The Imitation of the Rose. It is a commentary on gender roles, on illness and the pursuit of perfection. The main character, which I don't even believe she's named, I think she's named once a couple of pages in, she is ready to go out for a dinner party after returning home from a mental hospital, and she looks at a vase of roses and has a mental breakdown. That's all. Now, most of the story is intensely neurotic. I'd say 90% of it is these neurotic thoughts that she's having, and it's just the gradual breakdown of this mask of sanity that she's put on for everyone, or sanity, in quotations, and I'll explain what I mean by that. It's a lot of self-examination, lists, rambling on about time, about the maid, about the woman and her husband that she's going to see, and her husband not having to be worried about her, and being so happy to be tired, and how good of a wife she can be now that she's not ill. But the way that Clarice describes her illness is very unique. She discusses how others have felt about her illness, but then reveals her own perception of this heightened neurotic state that she was in. No longer to feel that terrible independence. No longer that monstrous and simple facility of not sleeping neither by day nor by night, which in her discretion had suddenly made her superhuman by comparison with her tired and perplexed husband. She, superhuman and tranquil in her bright isolation, and he, when he had come to visit her, he visiting her ceremoniously like a lover with heavy breath and fixed smile, forcing himself in his heroism to try to understand. He who had received this girl from Tijuca, who unexpectedly, like a tranquil boat spreading its sails over the waters, had become superhuman. She calls herself superhuman 3 times, tranquil twice. Interesting. Then she eventually has a breakdown, and her husband finally walks in the door, and she says this. "I couldn't help myself," she said, and her final compassion for this man was in her voice. One last appeal for pardon, which already came mingled with the arrogance of an almost perfect solitude. "I couldn't prevent it," she repeated, surrendering to him with relief the compassion which she, with some effort, had been able to contain until he arrived. "It was on account of the roses," she said modestly. The next moment, he averted his eyes, mortified by his wife's shamelessness as she sat there unburdened and serene. She was seated wearing her little house dress. He knew that she had done everything possible not to become luminous and remote. With fear and respect, he watched her. Aged, tired, and strange. But he did not even have a word to offer. From the open door, he saw his wife, sitting upright on the couch, once more, alert and tranquil, as if on a train that had already departed. Damn, that's a hell of an ending. Tranquil, unburdened, serene, luminous, remote. Her husband, this patriarchy, watches with fear and respect. This is not a common way to describe a mentally compromised person. From this description, it's almost as if the housewife has transcended to some further realm, like she's been deified, like she's been relieved of her human obligation, like she's unconfined and completely free. Superhuman. In this case, I would say that this is the dark feminine which has overcome the earthly problem, the existentialist problem. In the world of the dark feminine, it's almost as if this is a fucking success story. Unburdened and serene. For this housewife, the plague was being contained, being a wife to a husband, trying to fit into the conventional role which she was supplied. And it didn't work. But it's not discussed exactly like a failure. The conditioning failed. The foreign entity, which has attempted to live the way that we do, simply couldn't. And was completely fine with it. And her husband knows. Male masculinity, men, it knows the abysmal hole that this version of femininity is. And man will always stare into the face of it with fear. Just like I do, just like any normal person does. He stands and looks at her, not with pity, but with awe and reverence, like you would a god. That's so unusual. That's so strange. It's incredible. What I have warned against in this video is the hostility of ambiguity which the dark feminine imposes on you. And in The Imitation of the Rose is a fairy tale, in my opinion. The dream, the aim of those who have flirted with the edge of the unknown or fallen into it would be to somehow achieve serenity, tranquility, luminousness. Never have I ever heard such an existential cosmic success story that was just nestled neatly into a story about a 1960s housewife and a vase of roses. How do you fit all that into that? This was by far, as a concept, one of my favorites by Clarice, though reading it is actually a bit arduous. It's listening to the rambles of somebody in the midst of like what we would call maybe psychosis or mania, or as we would call it. The challenge that Clarice's characters face, like all of us who have unwittingly brushed up against the forbidden fabric of life face, is a seemingly impossible task. And many have went mad trying to decipher it, trying to explain it to us. The existentialists and other philosophers have quite literally gone insane trying to deal with this cognition, just to make sense of chaos, to live keenly and without dread, knowing that there is now a stranger in the room. It's a stranger which adopts no name, which has no form. We build landscape gardens around it, cities erect around it, works of art, but it's always there. It's there reminding you of the futility of your actions, juxtaposed with this vast hole, or as Clarice called it, in Near to the Wild Heart, this luminous wound, growing, floating, and dominating, which is grandiosely, overwhelmingly fatal. It's an existentialist's question that Clarice asks. It's a war with our humanity. And to be so aware is a blessing, but at times I feel like it's like a death sentence. It feels like all of life from now on is this incredible effort to stay alive, to not go mad, and maybe, if we're lucky, we become it. It absorbs us, and we're sitting upright on the couch, unburdened and serene.